you behaved very well. Well, that is not a question that economists are very good at answering. So what we do instead is we ask the question, pick a time horizon, let's say the next year. Do you see a lot of big concerns over the next year? And the answer is some concerns, especially in East Asia, especially relating to China within the next year. Also India. So when I say concerns, I mean if the data are accurate as forecasters, you might expect some kind of significant, let's say 10, 12% equity market corrections in Asia, if those kinds of analyses are correct. And then some other hot spots, some in Europe. Venezuela, of course, is a major issue, a continuing issue. And Kenya, strangely enough, came up in the data too. So it's, and the US, of course, because the US is a major source of some of the risk right now, and we're therefore bearing some of the risk ourselves. I think that there are two major things governments can do, which we have been trying to do since the last crisis. One has to do with making regulatory policy smarter. The other has to do with recognizing risks that arise from monetary policy. And both played a very significant role through a variety of mechanisms in the crisis that we had about a decade ago. I think that from a regulatory standpoint, I would say that the Basel improvements and the U.S. regulatory improvements have been half a loaf. I would say the major weakness is the failure to use information in the market to detect weaknesses in the major banks, and that has been a theme I've been pointing out. And another thing I would point to is from a monetary policy standpoint, although everyone says they're worried about the effect of low interest rates on encouraging bubbles to develop in asset markets, they talk a lot, but then they don't do anything about it. And I think right now we're seeing from a variety of perspectives, some new points of risk that if interest rates were to rise or if a recession, a global recession were to spread, that these magnifiers of risk are very much directly a consequence of the low interest rate policy. And the most obvious one there is the enormous growth in emerging market dollar-denominated corporate debt. So if we have a recessionary shock in Asia, or we have a US-China trade war or other kinds of shocks, they're going to be magnified by this big growth in dollar-denominated debt, which creates exchange rate risk for these companies. And that is a direct outcome and consequence of the low interest rate policies pursued by the Fed, the ECB, and the Bank of England. And so we haven't really fixed that problem. We keep talking about it, but we don't fix it. And of course, fixing it means we have to exit from this hyper low interest rate environment. And there's not a lot of policy willingness to do that. It's a great question. And you know, I've been working on this question from the standpoint of banking for the past 30 years. In fact, it's very specifically on this question, because the amazing thing about banks is that they were able to establish trust starting 2,600 years ago, that trust that people would hand them money and say, oh, go do what you want with it, and we understand you're not going to tell us what you're doing with it, and we'll be fine with that. So how did that ever happen? And the answer is lots of devices were used by bankers to create credibility, hard devices that establish trust. So to the elite that asks here in France and all over the world how we reestablish trust, I would say, doctor, heal thyself. Open your mind, recognize your own deficiencies, and consider that the political movements of populism that we're seeing all over the world are largely a reflection of the failure of the thinking of the elite, not just the communication. That's not a message the elite likes to hear.